Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and important strategic partnerships of India around the world. Viewers, this episode we are taking a close look at arguably the most important bilateral partnership of India with the United States. Given the impending arrival of the second administration of President Donald Trump, what will be US-India relations in the coming 4 years? What kind of new opportunities and challenges might arise? And how can the two partners take the special relationship to the next level? These are the lines of inquiry for this show. And to discuss this, I'm being joined from Washington, D.C., by one of the best-known analysts of US-India relations who is based in the US. She's Dr. Tanvi Madan. Dr. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, one of the top American think tanks, and she specializes on US foreign policy towards Asia, towards India and China in particular, and is the author of a highly regarded book on the triangular relationships of China, India, and the US. Dr. Madan, welcome back to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you. It's good to be back on your show.
Donald Trump has triumphed against all the odds and it's being talked about as the biggest political comeback in US history and probably even in world politics. So we are all now preparing, bracing, whatever we want to call it, for Trump 2.0. And you are there and you've seen this tightly contested election race and the outcome. And I'd like you to, if you can begin by reflecting on the current state of US-India relations, where they are, and what Trump is inheriting. I mean, Trump, of course, we have seen him once before from 2017 to 2020. Those were important years for the bilateral relationship. But there's an interregnum of 4 years under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So if you were to look at the big picture to start with, US-India comprehensive global strategic partnership, where are we today, you think, and what is the landscape of this partnership as we enter into Trump 2.0?
Thanks, Dr. Chaulia. I think, one of the things that it's easy to say now when we look back at the last 25 years of US relations with India is something that one can't generally say about other relationships that the US has, which is since Bill Clinton, every American president has left a better US-India relationship than they have found it. That was true of President Trump when he had his first term. The relationship in 2021 when he left office was better than 2017. And I would say that that is true today, that President Biden will leave a US-India relationship that is stronger, particularly in the defense, in the economic security, and the technology realms than he found it as well. And a closer convergence on strategic issues. That's not to say that there are not differences between the US and India, and I'm sure we'll talk about them. But what the strategic convergence has done over these many administrations, whether it's about the Indo-Pacific or about the challenge that China poses specifically, what that does is not just give the two sides reasons to cooperate and to deepen cooperation, even in areas that traditionally both sides haven't done, but it also incentivizes both countries to manage those differences that I mentioned and do so in a way that actually helps enable that broader cooperation, not pose a problem for it. So as US-India relations stand today, I would say that you still find for the US-India a very important partner, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but a broad relationship which includes economic ties that are independent of whatever is happening vis-a-vis China or diversification, people-to-people connection, of course, but also thinking about India as a technology partner, as a talent partner, in a way that is quite different from what we saw, especially during the second half of the Cold War. So a close relationship, one that I suspect India will want to maintain in the Trump years ahead. And they have had in Delhi, but in other places, experience with a Trump administration in the past. So I think in some ways, this is not going to be starting from zero in a way it was in the 2016-2017 period, but learning lessons from the past and thinking about how to adapt to the changes from them, even in terms of the Trump team and the Trump priorities.
You mentioned that this is a very unique strategic partnership, unlike most others that the US has, and you talked about 25 years of linear, progression in this relationship. So, to that extent, it's quite clear that it's a bipartisan consensus in the US that India is easily one of the most valuable partners for the US. So, despite the sharp ideological divisions within the US, the culture wars, and we saw all that during the election, and the contrasting policy agenda and prescriptions on domestic issues between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, it seems to us from here in Delhi that that bipartisan consensus is going to be sustained. No matter who controls the US Congress, the House or the Senate, no matter who is in the White House, at the big picture level, I think we can safely conclude that there are these underlying structural dynamics. You mentioned China and so many other factors, which will ensure that it will keep going forward, isn't it?
I think broadly you have seen, as you just mentioned, broad bipartisan consensus over the last 25 years. I do think that, depending on not just who is in the White House, but what the disposition in Congress is, who is in Congress, it does shape, for example, whether there's a Biden or a Trump or a Harris in the White House, it does shape priorities, prisms. So the way I think about it is, anytime you're thinking about an American administration and how they see a country like India, it's not just, what is their view of India or the policy towards India? Are they pro-India or anti-India or pro-China or anti-China? You have to step back and say, who is the principal? In this case, it'll be currently President-elect Trump, soon to be President Trump again. What is his view of the world? What is his worldview? So what is his prism? That's the second P. Then after you think about that, who the principal is, what his prism is, will define who he is going to choose in terms of his personnel. It is going to shape what his priorities are in the next term. And then those things combine in a blend to get the policies, whether towards India or the others. So one of the reasons you've seen a broad bipartisan consensus on India is the principles and the politicians who've been there on Capitol Hill, at least the majority of them, have a worldview where, particularly because of the strategic competition with China these days, since at least the last 10, 15, 20 years, but also because of India as it's emerging on the global stage, one could argue emerged already, particularly in the regional stage, and India that is a capable and, importantly, a willing partner is useful for several American priorities. Or it could be a problem for some American priorities. Regardless, it is a country that both sides have recognized needs to be engaged.
Yeah, point well taken. Dr. Madan, let's come to the Republicans. Let's come to Trump a little more now. If you see the 25-year progression, the George W. Bush administration, which was a Republican administration, was often credited with elevating the US-India partnership to a more strategic level and a more strategic dimension. And of course, Obama's 8 years were also productive. But then you had again Trump from 2017 to 2020, another Republican administration, which tended to focus more on the security dimension, more on the Indo-Pacific. For example, we revived the Quad during Trump 1.0 in 2017, and even the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US has been articulated more forthrightly in the Trump administration. Could we draw from this broad sweep of history, of recent history, that Republicans tend to be more in favor of advancing security cooperation and military and defense than Democrats? And if so, why is that? I mean, I'm just asking you what your thoughts are relative to Democrats and Republicans. There are differences, right? It's not like all continuity. So it does seem to me that there's more of sharper security edge when Republicans have in power when they look at India?
I would say that, if that was the case, you wouldn't see India deepen ties with the US in the defense and security side, because India doesn't want to deepen ties of this nature, of the sensitive nature, with any country that every time the government changes, you're going to have a different priority. So just look back at the last 4 years. There were these questions this time 4 years ago. Is a new Biden incoming administration not going to focus on security issues? Is going to be more accommodative to China? Is it not going to give a priority to India? Or, is it going to only focus on the values pillar of the relationship? Turned out none of that was true, right? Because as you said earlier, the structural fundamentals, which means if you're thinking about it from a US interest point of view, the rivalry with China, which is seen as a challenge to several US goals broadly, and I'll come back to, I think, there's a wild card with President Trump that I suspect South Bloc is already thinking about. But nonetheless, if you start from a point that if the prism and the worldview that the US has is that it is in a strategic rivalry with China, which the Biden administration pointed out was the only country that has the ability to challenge the US in several areas in a massive way, then a relationship with India, as long as India is willing, as long as India shares that worldview of China as a challenge, then you see the defense and security and technology ties will be deepened. So if you look back at the last 4 years, you've actually seen defense and security ties between the US and India deepen even further than in 2021 or January 2021. You've not just seen it on the bilateral side. You've seen, for example, the Quad take on more maritime security dimensions. You've seen more, for example, economic security collaboration. That only happens with countries that there is more trust in, where it is a strategic idea. In the recent bilateral statement, a significant step, and arguably potentially transformational if it goes through, was this idea that the US and India would work together to set up a semiconductor fab in India that would be focused on national security and military uses. So I think this thing, the broad structural fundamentals, whether with Democrats or Republicans, have been there. And I think the Biden administration has been transformational on that defense, economic security, and technology side. And I suspect there will be several people in this administration coming in that will want to see more of that. But I think it will come down to that question: how much the US is willing to do with India will depend then, and how it will see India will depend not just on bilateral issues, but how President Trump sees China.
Yeah, and on that point, like you said, it's been contradictory. 2017 to 2020, initially he launched a massive trade war, and then later on he entered into a deal to try and manage the economic competition with China. So this time around also, Dr. Madan, everyone is interested in knowing what will be the nature of the trade war. It's almost decided that there will be a trade war because that is Trump's trump card. The question is, on the economic front, also, it's not only security, like you said. How willing is Trump to press on all the accelerators to pressure China on the trade front and, convince or coerce American companies to disinvest from China? To the Biden administration was talking of friend-shoring. Maybe Trump is more of an economic nationalist and will look at onshoring, as in bringing back manufacturing to the US rather than to its partners and allies in Asia and beyond. So the question is, what do you think is the future of the economic relationship, which has been steadily growing even under Trump, despite the steel and aluminum tariffs and those sort of issues? The trade has continued to grow, although not at a breakneck speed, and it's steady. It's not like a revolutionary increase. Like, we have not reached $500 billion or $1 trillion India-US trade. But with Trump, there is always that cloud hanging that maybe that issue will come to the fore and probably play spoil sport or become an issue with India. What do you think?
So I think it depends on how it's approached. But let me just step back on the trade question, because this is not India specific. One thing we know about President Trump from his history, not just from when he was a politician, there are three issues on which he has had very strong personal views. Usually he is not a person who necessarily, he doesn't take a very ideological view, but he has very strong preferences on three different things. One is alliances. He thinks, he's much more transactional. He says, "What are you doing for me lately with allies?" Now, India doesn't have that problem because it's not an ally, and India, like it did in 2017, will make the case to him again. We're not actually asking you for a commitment. We are actually saying we're going to contribute. There will be that element, and this is also an economic element on the defense side, where one question will be, as you mentioned, you've seen now in the previous administration a mix of an approach of reshoring or onshoring, so bringing things back, manufacturing, including in the defense industry space back, nearshoring to Canada or Mexico. And the third has been friendshoring, including to countries like India. And that has also in the defense realm been in the defense industrial space. So, American companies co-producing in India, producing components. This is why, as Raksha Mantri Rajnath Singh has noted in the past, that when you look at India's defense exports, a lot of those come to the US. That's the topmost country destination for India's defense exports. That's because American companies have made India part of the supply chain. One of the things you might see with President Trump administration in the defense industrial space, but otherwise, is it depends on how the debate on alliances, but also on the economic side plays out. How will he look at American defense companies co-producing in India instead of, some will, say, he will say, you bring it back here. Second, so alliance has been one issue. I think this will be less of a problem for India because India will say, we're a partner, we are burden sharing, we don't have a commitment, and we're not, you're not giving us money as such. The second area President Trump himself has had strong feelings is trade. He thinks that America has been taken for a ride, and that other countries have either high tariffs or non-tariff barriers, or don't give American companies and goods market access. And the third has been immigration that he feels very strongly about, particularly illegal or undocumented immigration, but also there are some people in his circle that have problems with legal migration. I think those two issues will pose some challenges, but I think what I expect, because he has not just said vis-a-vis China, and he said anywhere from 60 to 100% trade tariffs for that. He said even any country that has he said sometimes across the board 10%, but particularly countries that have a surplus. India happens to be one of them. And India's surplus with the US has actually gone up since Trump was in power the first time. So I think on trade, will he pursue that with that trade war with China? I think he will, partly as a negotiating gambit. Will it be 60%? Not necessarily that could be an opening gambit. It could be him saying to Xi Jinping, that's my terms. Now, what are you going? And he's been very clear that sometimes he does this as a negotiating stance. Two things very quickly. This could either mean an opportunity for India, depending on how Trump views friendshoring, in the sense that if he's fine with, because you've already heard some American apparel and footwear companies, for example, say we're going to take some production out of China because we think there will be higher tariffs. For India, this is an opportunity. Now, this is not to do with Trump. I think this is a broader case to be made. Currently, those companies are saying we're thinking about Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, others. It's an opportunity and moment for India to say, no, you should actually, even on textiles, consider India. Yeah. The challenge for India, even if there are tariffs on China, is what does this do to the global economy? What does this do to India's imports from China? So that becomes a bit of a challenge. What does it do? How disruptive it is for the global economy? One caution, like on China, trade will be a subject of debate within various schools of thought within the administration. Some people on the political side will argue that one of the reasons President Trump won this election is people's concerns about inflation. Tariffs, high tariffs could have an inflationary impact. So that is not the way you want to go about it, or you don't want it to be too high. That is one possibility. others could argue that, yes, this is the way you want to do it. So I think there's still going to be a debate, whether on trade, whether on China, whether on friendshoring, reshoring.
And with Trump, there's always a tussle because he brings the populist approach, and then there's the so-called permanent state or the deep state of the bureaucracy, which has a more long-term view and wants the US to maintain its global leadership. Dr. Madan, we are running out of time, but I want to take you up on one more point. Regional strategy, Indo-Pacific, you already mentioned, and in fact, our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramanian Jaishankar, also commented after the US election results that he expects that the hedging by many countries will increase now that Trump has come into power. So I'd like your comments on this, because hedging is the idea that you're not fully committed, because the US itself under Trump will not make any commitment to defend any of its allies or partners as much as the Democrats and the liberals do. So I'd like you to reflect on that. Is the US going to become, quote unquote, more unreliable? And suppose there's a crisis, suppose China attacks any one of these countries, including India, how credible are US security guarantees and promises of support, and or will we all have to relook our relationships with China in the Indo-Pacific because we cannot bank on the US anymore? That's always been the problem with Trump, because he says, I'm not going to spend blood and treasure on some faraway island somewhere 10,000 miles away.
Look, I think as far as India is concerned, India has chosen not to have a security guarantee from the US anyway. India has always hedged. I don't call it hedging. I call it India's strategy of diversification. Because India, since independence, and every government, no matter how different they are in India, every prime minister has followed a policy of diversification. You can call it non-alignment in the Cold War. You can call it multi-alignment today. Underlying it is maintaining a diversified portfolio of partners, because you fundamentally think that you don't want to outsource your security to another country, because you think other countries decide things on their interests. And that has been, India either is uncertain or doesn't want to be over dependent on any one country. So I think India has always kind of, I don't like the word hedging because it suggests that India is kind of a swing state, equidistant from US and China or other. I don't think this is an equidistance policy. What this is India will and has hedged against uncertainty about the US and overdependence on the US. What I think you will see, which I suspect the External Affairs Minister was alluding to, is what India found in the last Trump administration for itself, but also for other countries and American allies, is because they have security guarantees that they're not sure of, that they will essentially start also pursuing these diversification strategies. And what that meant for India is that Europeans were more interested in developing ties with India, and India suddenly became more interested in Europe. Same with Australia, same with Japan. Yeah. Nonetheless, for all these countries, including India, the US remains an important country. So I think, the way I think India will approach a Trump administration is it will reinforce India's existing instincts and strategic preferences of both aligning as much as possible, cooperating as much as possible, but not depending on that for its existential security, and therefore doing two things. One or three things: indigenization, continuing to build Indian capabilities. Second, widening and deepening other sets of partnerships. And third, I expect that India will therefore also be incentivized to try to stabilize that relationship with China, as it is already doing. But at the same time, it'll have to watch very carefully that if China thinks that it's in a better shape with the US relationship, it could put pressure on India. Just finally, you had a Trump administration that extended support to India during Galwan. So at a time, and took India's side in a very public way, in a way some traditional Indian partners did not. So I think it'll depend on the worldview about China. It will depend on the personnel, not just at the cabinet level, but key positions like the National Security Council. And it will depend on how much countries think a country like the US thinks India will actually be a willing partner. Because just like India asks, what have you done for me lately? Are you reliable? The questions are also there in the US.
It's vice versa.
how reliable is India as a partner, including if there are other contingencies in the Indo-Pacific?
Absolutely. So, viewers, fascinating discussion with Dr. Tanvi Madan of Brookings Institution. And I think the sum of what she's saying is that it's not necessarily everything is set in stone. There's still going to be a lot of debate within the incoming Trump administration between different factions. The president himself has his, own unique and unmistakable, strong viewpoints on many things relating to India, relating to Asia, relating to China and the world. But then there are many other players in the system. The US is not, it's a presidential system where there's a lot of executive power in the hands of the the occupant of the White House, but there are so many other players who are also there. And I think India will be also wanting to work with all of them to mitigate some of the potential rough edges that might come in because of the Trump factor. But Trump administration and the US as a whole is something much bigger than just the president. I think there are so many other allies and partners we have built up over in this last 25 years of this strategic partnership. And I think that is going to continue to keep us in good stead. I want to thank Dr. Tanvi Madan for always giving us the nuances and the subtleties, because these days it's very easy to say Trump is good for India or Biden is bad for India, but Trump will not interfere in our internal affairs, Biden interfered. We hear a lot of that conversation, but you've taken us to a higher level where we are thinking about this relationship is, inexorable, and we cannot dispense with the US partnership, and we must all work together by understanding the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts. And thank you for sharing lots of those ideas with us, Dr. Madan. Thank you, Dr. Chaulia. So viewers, US-India Comprehensive Global Strategic Partnership is all set for an elevation under President Donald Trump's second administration from 2025. We have no doubts that this relationship, which has been thriving under Democrats and Republicans, will continue to grow. The question is, how do we manage some of the challenges and make sure that we extract the most from this relationship? India's relationship with China is always going to be a very, very central factor in the way we deal with the US, and so is the US's relationship with China. That will impact how the US approaches India. So this, keep an eye on this triangle, and it's always been a fascinating one. There have been so many different shifts over the time, but now it's quite steady. The US-India partnership is going to grow, and we will have to manage the China challenge together. And that's the big, takeaway in the coming 4 years. And we will hope that President Trump and the entire system there also align on this point. So let's keep close watch on this triangle, US, China, India, and how that is going to ultimately shape the future of US-India bilateral relations. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.